to make sure that you're here because I'm not going to really go over it again. If you miss it, you will be missing some very critical material. We will be discussing the essential topic we will be discussing next week is what we can know about the Ribono Shel Olam, God, about His essence and about His nature. And it's a very without saying. Okay, but that's a key thing. We have to understand who God is, really. To have some sense of what He is and how He is, to really begin to relate with Him. Okay, so we'll do that. There is an outside chance that the week after we will also have a combined share, because I may want to go over the reason why we're having, because the truth of the matter is we have this year that I'm giving next week is on schedule for you people. Really, it's really Series 1, Tape 4. It's on schedule for the, but this has been given to the men before, but it is such an important year that I want a review, and there are a lot of new men in this year that have not heard it, and it's extremely critical. It is probably one of the most critical shears in the entire series. That's how important it is. Okay, so let me just say that next week is at 8 o'clock, and I urge you to attend almost under all conditions, if you can, because like I say, it's really that important. Okay, tonight we will conclude Series 1, Tape 3, and for those people who have not been here last week, I'm not going to go over what we discussed last week. It was a very large, exhaustive topic about the nature of life in many ways, the nature of consciousness to some extent, what it means to be alive, what is the relationship between the neshama. For the new people, if you don't know a word, anyone who doesn't know a Hebrew word, just raise your hands, okay? And let me know. I'll determine next week. There may be another combined share.
Continuation.
Well, probably not. It will be on the next most critical topic in all of Judaism. What is the essence of a Jew? What does it really mean to be Jewish? The essence of it, really. And from that share, I may do it as a combined share probably because I want to do it as a review. We will begin to understand what being Jewish is about, but more than that, who the great men of Judaism were, the great tzaddikim. What is the tzaddik like? You see, try and find out something about the personality of that kind of an individual, and what is the progression of sequences in going from one level to another in Judaism itself. But I may do that again, combined group.
Rabbi, before you begin, what if one has a series? What is the
Tape 6?
So
next week is Series 1, Tape 4, and the following week it will be part of Series 1, Tape 6.
So we'll
go back to 5 again. So Tape 6 will be. But I'll announce that next week. Next week is Series 1, Tape 4, for those who have that. Series 1, Tape 4 will be a very difficult tape to understand. You can listen to it and work through it. You're probably going to have a very hard time. Next week will clear up the entire matter. Okay. Let's go on. I do want to just settle one matter over here. Who is interested in getting the tapes from these shurim that I give? Is there anyone interested in that? Not really. Because most of you take notes. So you probably feel that your notes are equivalent. Is there anyone interested in a little bit about what a Navi is, what a prophet is, and so on? Today we're going to go into much more the details of what is a prophet, in a sense. How do we know who the prophet and who's not? And then finally, the most important question, which I'd like to finish today, how do we know that the Torah was given to Moshe at Har Sinai? Which is really one of the most fundamental questions in Judaism itself. Now, there is something in Judaism called a Navi, or a prophet. What exactly is a prophet? We have said last week that when a person reaches a certain level of holiness, of kedusha, he allows himself to become a conduit, or a channel, or a vehicle So a great deal of spiritual light comes through him. And when he's in touch with this spiritual light, he can literally begin to read what's in that light. Now we discussed last week, and I'm not going to go into it. He's able to read that light because a person is really like a line. He's really connected to all the planes of existence. There are many planes of existence. And a person is not a point which exists on any specific plane, but like a line that exists on all of those planes concurrently at the same time. Because of this, if a person is able to contact or connect with each specific aspect of existence in him, he can literally then become privy to the kinds of thoughts or information or data which is extent in that plane of existence. Do we all understand that? A prophet is simply an individual who is able to literally come in contact with his neshama while he's yet alive in such a way that he can literally read what his neshama says. Now, how does his neshama know anything? Because his neshama exists on a spiritual plane which is extraordinarily high, and is privy or is connected to information in that level of spirit. And what happens is, a prophet is someone who can read his neshama while he's alive. Normally that would be impossible. You cannot read it because we're in a body, so we can only relate to aspects of thought through the human brain. We cannot relate to aspects of neshama or spirit directly. That's not too high. A prophet can. But how do we know who's a prophet? How do we know that? How do we know? Just because someone comes along and says, hey, I'm a prophet. I have just spoken to God. Now the Torah says that there is a certain phenomenon called prophecy. That phenomenon once existed. It no longer exists. The phenomenon called prophecy, which is a spiritual event, went out, departed from the Jews, and it departed from all mankind, because there were some goyim who were prophets too, notably Bilam. And we'll get into that some other time. But it left mankind at the destruction of the first temple in 586, approximately BCE. A little really thereafter. By 500 BCE, there were no more prophets in Israel. The last three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those were the last three prophets. They died in between the first and second temple, and that was the end of prophecy. No man has ever risen since that time who had the ability to communicate on such a high level of spirituality while he was alive. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Zechariah. I don't know, Zechariah, I don't know if it's in English. I don't know how to say it in English. Haggai is Haggai, I don't know how to say that. Haggai. That's how you spell it. And Zechariah is Zechariah, and Malachi is, I think it's Malachi. I think that's what they say.
Yes.
Yes, if I have my... How do we know who's a prophet? Somebody comes over and says, I am a prophet. God has just spoken to me. What do you say? Well, the first thing you do is you instantly refer him to a diagnostic evaluation. Right? That's what you would do today. Well, why is it any different before? Somebody comes over and says he spoke to God. How do we know he's not psychotic? With delusions. The answer is we don't. The answer is we never really will with certainty. But there are ways to minimize the odds. How? Because a prophet must have several criteria. Number one, he must have an established reputation as a very holy person, as a great tzaddik. Number one. He must have been known as a great man, a holy tzaddik. You all know what the word tzaddik means? The word tzaddik means a righteous man. Do you know what the word kadosh means? Kadosh means a holy man. Who is greater, a tzaddik or a kadosh? Kadosh. A tzaddik is known by certain types of his actions and by a certain level of dvekut, or relationship with God. A kadosh is much higher on that level. We'll get into that distinction later on. in order for someone to be a prophet, he must have had an established reputation as a kadosh, as a holy person. Now, I'm not going to define what that is, since it's really not relevant these days. None of you will be on the prophetic selection committee, so it really doesn't matter. But we will go into that later on, what a kadosh is. It is important to know. That's number one. Number two, even if the man is a kadosh, we still don't accept what he says. Why? Because fundamentally, prophecy is a subjective experience. You see, there's no way to determine that a person speaks to God. How? It's subjective. He says it. How do I know? You see. So we must establish certain criteria of objectivity. The first being that he's a kadosh. In other words, a man, he fits in that possibility of becoming a prophet. God doesn't give prophecy to regular people, or to ignorant people, or to foolish people. He only gives prophecy to very great people, and not even very great people, to people who are kadoshim. What is the second criteria? Well, we give him a test, and we say to him, we want you to tell us what will happen in the future. That's the test. We want you to tell us what will happen in the future in detail. We don't want you to tell us in general, but you've got to specifically tell us something which is going to happen, let's say 3 weeks from now, down to minute details. If the man is wrong, down to the minute detail, even if he's correct to everything else, he is a false prophet. You hear that? The man says, this is the way it's going to happen. A, B, C, D. And it happens A, B, C. False prophet. That's astonishing, isn't it? Now you may say, why are we so tough with the guy? Because it's a very simple thing. There are two types of prophets. Rather, there's really one type, but there are two functions to a prophet. One is a function of self, and the other is a function of the community. It's a communal function. What do I mean? Prophecy is a level of contact with God. You can be a prophet. You don't have to go around telling people you're a prophet. No one's business. If you reach that level and suddenly you become privy to all kinds of information, who says you have to say, let's give it out? It's a level of spirit. It's a level of spiritual attainment. Now, in terms of that, we don't care who's a prophet or not. That's no one's business. That's your business, and that's it. But there are certain prophets who God says, I want you to go to the community, to the Jews, and tell them the following. Thus saith the Lord, Koyama Hashem, thou shalt not, and so on and so forth. Who are prophets like that? Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Yeshaya, right? All Shmuel, Samuel, all the prophets in which we have, right? In the book, in the Torah, the Tanakh, right? Those are the prophets. These are the prophets that God commanded to go to Israel, the house of Israel, and begin to tell them critical information that they needed to know to be good Jews. It is with the communal function of prophecy that we are concerned with, not the self function. You see. Because if a person is a prophet unto himself, fine. But if the person is coming to me and starts telling me what I should and should not do, I think, hey, wait a minute. What are your credentials? Now, why do I have to know his credentials? Why can't I just listen to what he says and say, well, that sounds interesting. I'll think about it. Because you can't do that. Because one of the commandments in the Torah says the following. If a prophet comes unto you and tells you, and he's a confirmed or a certified prophet, and he tells you that this is what I said, you must do it. If you fail to do it, you are liable to the death penalty, the B'dei Shemayim. God says, I will exact your life. Hey, that's serious. God says, if you don't listen to a prophet who has been certified, and we will discuss the certification process, you don't listen to him, I will exact your life. You will die before your time. That's number one. Number two, if the prophet refuses to to divulge the information. Like Jonah. Remember Jonah, he ran away? Then the prophet is obligated to die before his time. This is very serious business, you see. Thus, there is a specific commandment to listen to a prophet. It is a positive command in the Torah that to a prophet who comes, who is certified, you must listen to him. If you don't, you are chayav what's called Misa B'dei Shemayim. Misa B'dei Shemayim means death at the hands of heaven. It means no basin, no court of law can continue on earth. They will do it up there. And suddenly, the person finds himself killed by some accident or whatever have you, shortly thereafter. Now, that's why, with respect to the communal function, we have a right to say, wait a minute, if I've got to listen to you, you see, because the Torah says that, I want to make sure that you're a prophet, and you're not fooling around with me. What happens if this man is a false prophet? Then he is obligated to die, but not by the Shemayim. He is obligated to die by stoning, by a Bezin Shamata. The Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin, would certify him, because the certification process took place by the great court, what's called the Sanhedrin, the great court. They would certify him. And if he was shown to be a false prophet, in the ways that I will shortly show you, he was obligated to die by skila, by the Sanhedrin itself. And if he was certified, then everyone had to listen, even the Sanhedrin. And if they didn't listen, they were obligated for the death penalty by the hands of heaven. You see what I'm saying? So obviously this is very serious, and you can see why. God told Jeremiah to go to the people and say, if you don't begin to start doing what the Torah says in a very serious way, I am going to destroy the whole temple and lay Jerusalem to waste. That's what Jeremiah said. Now that's very serious. That's why God wants Jeremiah to say this. So first they have to certify Jeremiah. If he's a prophet, they had better start listening to him. Because if they don't start listening to him, his prophecy is going to come true. And as we all see, his prophecy did come true. It did come true. So, we are concerned with certifying a prophet with respect to his communal function, not with respect to his self-instructive function. How many prophets in Israel had a communal function? Or public function? How many? Not many. How do we know? Well, look at the books of the Bible. Maybe there's 24 prophets. They're not many. 30, 40. That's all. God sends very few prophets to Israel to tell them things. How many prophets were there in Israel who had the ability to prophesy by themselves? They reached such a high level of kedusha, holiness, that they had the ability to prophesy, but they were never commanded to go out and tell anyone. Right? Over 1 million. Isn't that staggering? In those days, could you imagine living on a block where 80% of your block were prophets? You would be afraid to go out, wouldn't you? What? The Gemara says that. That there were over 1 million prophets who lived at that time. Now you're staggered. You say, wow, that's incredible. But it wasn't that incredible. Why? Because you must remember that in those days, they had the ability to become prophets. Today we don't. So you're saying, well, why are there no prophets now? How come I can't find one? The answer is because it is not possible to become a prophet today. That gift is no longer here. When that gift was available, there were a lot of people who were smart enough to avail themselves of it. Jews are not stupid. But it takes a lot of work. As you can see, it's an enormous amount of work to become a prophet. You see. But obviously the rewards are well worth it. So we're concerned with the communal function of a prophet. What's the communal function here? 1, he has to be a Kaddish. What are the criteria? He has to be a Kaddish. Number 2, he has to be tested at least 3 times with ability to him to predict the future to the exact detail. Now that rules out all your psychics. Because psychics cannot tell the future with exact detail. And they cannot tell it with accuracy. If the psychic, for example, like who? Jan Dixon, whoever's an accepted psychic today, whatever the story is, if they start telling you things, maybe they're right 10% of the time, 20% of the time, I don't know. And if they're right, they may be right with respect to a general idea. But you will not see a psychic that can pinpoint things down to an incredible degree. Such a thing does not exist. but a prophet had that ability. He had to have that ability, or else he would have been a false prophet. He had to do it 3 times. 3 times. Now, he didn't have to split the Red Sea again, or do something else miraculous. He just had to do that. And the Torah says that once you've certified a Navi, once you've determined that after 3 times he has that ability, he is then a prophet. Once he is a prophet, you must listen to him. Like I said, that is essentially what's involved in prophecy. Why do I say all this for? Because this is very, very critical to understand the origin of any religion. You see, this is very critical. We don't accept people who just come along and say, I know this, and I say this, and God spoke to me. We don't just accept the person that says that. We give them an examination. I mean, it's a very rigorous examination, you see. Now, once he's passed that examination, can we say definitely that this man is a prophet? No, we still can't. Because who knows? Who knows? As long as prophecy remains a subjective experience, we will never know what really went on in this guy's head. But the Torah says, you still must listen to him. Why? Because there's got to come a point when we deal with reality. For example, the Torah says that if 2 witnesses come along and say, Reuven killed Levi, we examine those witnesses, right? Very thoroughly. Back and forth. And we find that we can't budge these witnesses. That they seem to be good witnesses. Well, what's the law? What happens if Reuven did kill Levi? What do we do to Reuven? Death penalty. Anyone who kills another person, he has a death penalty. In Talmudic times, right? We would kill who? Levi. Rather Reuven. But what happens if we find that what? That these witnesses are false? You see. Can we always believe witnesses? Are they always definitely true? No. Sometimes witnesses lie. But we have to run the society. And God says, you must do what you have to do. You are not God. You can't read human minds. So therefore, you must take witnesses or prophets, no matter who it is, who relate experiences which you cannot know with absolute certainty. And you must do it to the best of your ability. You must examine them fully, back and forth, and determine their accuracy. And if you do the best you can, you must then follow what they say, even if it means killing someone, or follow what a prophet says. And God says, if they are false and you did not know it, I will take care of it. Leave that to me. But you must do what's within human possibility. You see what I'm saying? This is very important to understand. Thus, if we certify prophets, and we determine that they're accurate and they're true, we must follow them. Let's go back. Let's go back 3,000 years ago to the time of the Exodus to Egypt. Let's look at the Jews at that time, okay? And let's look at what they experienced. They were given the Torah, right? The 5 books of Moshe. They were given to by Moshe. The basic question that we ask is, where did this Torah come from? Moshe picks up this Torah and says, you see these books? These were given to me by God. God gave me these books, and so on. What's the first question you said? How do we know? How do I know? The Mormons. Some guy Joseph Smith found a bunch of tablets in the middle of a cave in 1840 something, written in who knows what. And he said that they were there from God, or an angel revealed that, and so on. How does anyone know? There's a whole religion based on that. Muhammad came and said God spoke to him and did who knows what. How does anyone know? There's 500 million people that's running around this world believing what he said. How does anyone know? Jesus, or people after Jesus, determined that he was what? A divine being, whatever the story is. And he said this and that. 2 witnesses said that he rose from the dead. How does anyone really know? What? Because one person said it, because a man said that he was this or that. How do we know? Moses comes and says, this is the Torah. God wrote it. How do we know? So you may say, well, wait a minute. We got a way to find out. Let's test them on a prophecy. Let's do that. But wait a minute. This is before the Torah was given. Before the Torah was given, there was never any commandment to believe in a prophet. So, what do I care? You see, what he did or didn't do. How do I know? You say they know. Jews are not stupid. It's like Golda Meir once said to Nixon, what's the difference in your country and my country? In your country, you have 200 million people and one president. In my country, we have what? 3 million people and 3 million presidents. What does that mean? Every Jew wants to be a boss. You know that. Every Jew has got to figure it out better. There's got to be a better way, a smarter way, a shorter way, a faster way. You see, that's what it is. You think that Moshe can put the story over a whole bunch of Jews at that time? Not so fast. You think Jews are going to accept a whole bunch of new impositions and restrictions, you see, without examining where this comes from? Would you? If I said to you, hey, this is a book given to me by God, and then it says here, you can't smoke, can't eat, can't do this, you can only sleep between 4 midnight, to 4 in the morning to 12 in the afternoon, you cannot sleep any other time, you can only eat bagels and lox. I mean, let's say that was the thing. Would you believe me? Of course not. You say, well, wait a minute. How do I know this? Right? You think the Jews are going to accept this imposition? 613 commandments because a man came and said that they were given by God? Of course not. So then why did the Jews believe that he gave it? Number one. And why do we believe that he gave it? Especially since we weren't even there. You see the question? Yes. Why do I say the question so strongly? Because many people are bothered with this question, basically. And there are many people who probably ask you this question. Really? I wasn't there. How do I know? It's very important to understand what that question is about and really how to understand what the Torah says about that. But there's more than that. There's another way to deal with that question, and that's the following way. The question is not why we believe that Moses gave us the Torah. The question is more fundamental, is on God himself. God gave us all brains to think and an intellect, and God says, use it. That's the fundamental thing. How do we know God did that? Because that's the way he made us. If God made us with a mind, with an intelligence, it's because he intends us to use it. But didn't God turn around and suspend that intelligence and simply say, believe whoever came over to you, who relates to you a subjective experience and tries to control your life? Of course not. God himself would not do such a thing. It's against his very creation. You see what I'm saying? God created your mind as an analytical tool. Let's first talk about the Jews of that time. What happened at that time? Let's not talk about us. There are two different concepts. First we will talk about the Jews who lived at that time. Okay? What happened and why they believed Moses. And then we'll talk about us today. Us today and the Jews at that time. What happened? What happened was an extraordinary series of events. Here you had the mightiest nation on earth, ancient Egypt. The kingdom of earth under Ramesses probably in the age of the empire, controlling a certain number of people, a certain nation within its midst, the Jews, or rather the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they technically weren't Jews. You see, how many were there? Probably about 2 million people, men, women, and children. On the exact census itself that was taken at a time, there were 600,000 male adults over 21. Well, between children and women, there were approximately, let's say, 2 million people, controlled by the Egyptian Empire. What happens? Comes a man in, Moshe, and begins to wreak havoc. Begins to turn the whole place upside down. Blood turns to water, frogs come out, day turns to night. Every firstborn of Egypt dies. demonstrated the existence of God? Moses? No. God. For one of the first times in history, God himself descended into natural law and subverted it as an exact demonstration that he is the master of natural law. Remember we speaking about last time the notion of Teva, that natural law hides the hand of God? Well, for the first time God removed that veil and showed that his was the power behind reality. His was the power. Hence what the Jews saw at that time was a clear revelation of one fact, that God is the power of creation and the power of reality itself. That was clear to the Jews at that time, without doubt. Moses, Moshe was obviously an instrument. You see, Moshe didn't do this. They all witnessed it, they and all the Egyptians. This was witnessed by millions of people as a national event. It was not witnessed by one person, it was witnessed by millions of people. Many, many people saw this. Not one, two, not a group, not even a small tribe. 2 nations witnessed it together. That's number one. Hence the fact that God exists was clearly demonstrated. The fact that his power is absolute is clearly demonstrated by God himself. What happens? They all leave Egypt and they go to Mount Sinai. You see, what happens? You think Moses went up to Mount Sinai and brought down the Torah and said, this is it? You think the Jews would have believed him even then? Well, wait a minute, you say. Hey, wait. If Moses was obviously the instrument of God to do all these things, you see, why couldn't Moses come down and say, this is the Torah given to me by God? Who would fail to believe him, really? If Moses was involved in all the miracles of Egypt, why would you then say, hey, what are you, a crackpot? No one would say that. He had a legitimacy already, didn't he? Right? No, but that's the point. They still didn't believe him. Because if Moshe would have come down and said, I have these laws on the basis of my prophecy, because I'm a prophet, they would have said, look, we were all involved in the miracles of Egypt. But how do we know you were really a prophet? You're a holy man. There is no real prophecy as far as we know, and even if you were a prophet, we are not obligated to listen to you. There is no commandment that says, thou shalt listen to a prophet, because the Torah has not been given yet. So why do we have to listen to you? You see what I'm saying? And they would have been right. Moses had no authority to what? To legislate, or to give, or to reveal what? To these people. Something which they must obey, because such a commandment had never been given to them. Hence, prophecy alone was really irrelevant. So this entire discourse that I gave you about a Navi is irrelevant. And I gave it to you to show you that even though a prophet is absolutely valid with respect to the giving of the Torah at Sinai, it's irrelevant. And the reason why the Jews accepted the Torah has nothing to do with the fact that Moses was a prophet and spoke to God. You see what I'm saying? Why then did they believe it? They believed it because they all heard it themselves. What am I talking about? Essentially what happened was an interesting thing. God revealed when he started giving the commandments, the first of the 10 commandments. On the first 2 commandments, he didn't give to Moshe. He gave it to everyone. And suddenly a most amazing phenomenon happened. Every Jew in Israel became a prophet. Everyone heard the voice of God. Everyone. Astounding. You see. It wasn't given to Moses. They all heard it. But there was a very big problem. They couldn't handle it. It was too powerful. And they all died. Yes. All Israel died after the first 2 commandments. There wasn't a soul left. What did God do? He revived them from the dead. That was the first instance of mass resurrection of the dead. Why did God do that? We cannot go into that now. There's a very deep thing behind that. You see. But that's what happened. They all heard the voice of God themselves, but none of them were on the level to hear such a thing. Their neshamas were not high enough, and they all died. Their neshamas jumped right out of their bodies. Just jumped out, because the spiritual magic was so powerful, it just drew the neshamas out. Now, Moses also heard, but Moses did not die. Why? Because Moshe had the correct neshama for that kind of experience. Now, that's number one. Number two, when they all heard it, they did not hear it like Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Why? Because the truth of the matter is, God cannot speak directly to a person, really, while he's awake. They all had that. The way they heard it, they didn't hear God talking to them. They heard God talking to Moshe. That's what it was. It's like I hear you talking to someone else. And the prophetic experience that they had was that when Moshe heard the Torah, he heard God talking to him, saying, I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, and so on. What did they hear? They heard God talking to Moshe from the distance. I am the Lord thy God. So they heard through prophecy what God was speaking to another man. That's what happened. Now, hence, why did they believe that Moshe was correct when he gave them the Torah? Well, after the first two commandments, the Jews said, we don't want to hear anymore. We can't handle it. So God said, then I will give it from now on only to Moshe. So when Moshe came down later on and gave them the rest of the commandments, of course they believed that Moshe was a prophet. Why? Because they were all prophets themselves. They heard what Moshe heard. For the first and only time since the creation of the world, prophecy was more than a subjective experience. It became an objective experience because the entire nation heard the prophetic performance. You see what I'm saying? Hence there was no need for a certification. You only must certify a subjective phenomena. But a phenomenon which is public and thus objective is not required to have any kind of certification process, you see. For example, if you witness a certain event, and then later on someone says to you, well, how do you know this thing happened? So you say, well, the other person says, well, I heard it from someone else. How do you know? So you say, I didn't have to hear it from someone else. I saw it myself. You don't need testimony when you yourself are the witness. The same thing here. They didn't believe that the prayer was from God because Moses said it. They believed this was from God because they themselves heard it. That's the essence. So hence, just like the miracles in Egypt was a public, national event, so was the giving of the Torah was a public, national event, where they all became prophets. You see, that's why they believed in Moshe, for no other reason. Are there any questions?
Just a question was put to me when I was hearing this debate about what if it was mass hysteria and we really saw or heard nothing?
What was it?
How come Hashem did not develop there in the time that they trusted to get the Torah, that the Neshimas were not able to handle it?
Well, how come what?
You said that after the first two they died and then were resurrected.
Yes.
How come they were not able? I mean,
they didn't have that level of soul.
Yeah, but who creates a level of soul like that?
But the question that you really should ask is, if God knew they wouldn't have the ability, why did He give it to them in the first place?
And weren't they?
That's the question that really I think is on the minds of people, right?
Yes. And
right?
They took 40 years for them to get it, right?
Who?
How long? 40 days?
No. They would have gotten it right away. It took them 40 years because of the sin of the golden calf. But leave that aside. God gave them the Torah so that they should all die on purpose. Why? Because what He wanted, and what's a very important principle that I will lay down now, and I will repeat many, many times in the future, and explain better and better, is that the truth of the matter is that when the Jews received the Torah at that time, immediately thereafter was supposed to have been ushered in the Messianic era. God never had any intention at that time to continue civilization as we know it after the Jews left from Egypt. Or to put it in the more vernacular, the Gula Rishona, the first redemption, was supposed to be the Gula Shlema, was supposed to be the last redemption. There was no intention to go beyond the Jews of Egypt. God had intended that those Jews should usher in the Messianic period and the world should come to its conclusion at that point in time. The reason why that plan was removed is because the Jews were not worthy to because of the sin of the golden calf. That was the last test that was given to them. Had they passed that test, we would not be in the way we are now. The Messianic era would have started a long time ago, and reality as we know it would have been in a whole different vein. Don't ask me how reality would have been. In order to understand that, you're talking about a half a year's work. But that's what it would have been.
That's what God intended.
That's clearly, we know that. We know that from the Torah itself, and the Medrash and the Gemara clearly opens that up and shows us that this is what would have happened.
Because God clearly knew.
What?
He clearly knew that the Jews would.
But wait a minute, you can't. That question we will take up later on.
That's the whole.
But that's what God knew that Adam would sin too. Because that's the question. How does God's knowledge have to do with your free will? That's a separate question. We will discuss that later on. But there is no contradiction. You have absolute free will, and even though God knows what will be in the future, is not, you see, an obstacle to your free will at all. That's the rule that's laid down, and we know that, you see. Hence, once that is, it doesn't matter what God knows. God simply has to do what He does in order to bring mankind to its ultimate destiny and its highest level. You see, that's what He does. We must determine how well that is done. And what was intended was that mankind should end at that period. Now, you all look at and say, well, that's an incredible fact. What does that mean? What does that mean? It's difficult to explain that now, you see. Because the truth is, I'll tell you even better things. The truth of the matter is, the whole thing should have ended by Adam. God had no intention for it to go on after the first man, after Adam Rishon. You see, the only reason why the world continued is because Adam failed. If Adam had not failed, if he had not eaten from the Eitz Hadas overall, right? If he would have waited until Shabbos, he was created in Erev Shabbos, Friday afternoon. If he would have waited till Shabbos, right? Then the world would have ushered into the Messianic time, into the future world, right then and there. You may ask, what would have happened to all of us?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So you're all saying, thank God Adam failed. Because where would I be? No. What? Yes. Yes. Basically, just to answer this in a very small way, is we were all contained within Adam. That's the answer. We all exist separately, but there was once a point in time when we were all merged into one soul called Adam Rishon. Adam Rishon was a person, you see. Imagine every neshama from everyone who lives today and before, all the neshamas from all the prophets and all the sages and all the great tzaddikim down to the generations, from all the people from the beginning of time to now, rolled up into one bundle. That neshama was called Adam Rishon, the first man. Could you imagine what kind of person he must have been? Staggering, isn't it? Yes, it is. That's what happened. Now, why the course of events followed that way, we will have to discuss later on. We go into many, many deep principles here, which I don't want to go into. But the first critical period, or the first critical time when mankind could have obtained its tikkun, its redemption, or its level of perfection, was with Adam. He failed. It had to go on. The second time was with the Jews of Egypt. They failed. There will be a third time, and that will be the ultimate time, and that will succeed. That is the promise of God. That's the promise of the Messianic time, that there will come a time when you will succeed.
You know it's the third time?
There will even more than 3 times. As far as we're concerned, these 3 are sufficient. But the last time will succeed, whether we want to or not. That is called the end, or the cape, or the final redemption. You see, in Hebrew that's called the following. The word is symbolized just the word cape. Cape means end. End. Cape means that there will come a year, or a certain time, a certain day, from the beginning of time to that time. Nobody knows when it will be. There are only 2 people in the history of mankind who have ever known that date. One was Yaakov, and the other one was Daniel. They were the only two people who ever was revealed that date. That is the last date when the ultimate perfection must be achieved. And the world cannot go on as it is now. That is our guarantee that mankind will not wipe itself out. And that the world will reach its ultimate conclusion. Yes? No. No. That's not Yechezkel. That's not Yeshaya. And it wasn't told that. That was just another thing that was told about some other people. No. Only Daniel, and Yaakov knew it. Yaakov wanted to reveal it to his son, and he forgot it before he was able to do it. What I've seen somewhere is that there was another person who knew it, who was Joseph, his son. That I'm not 100% clear, but I think Joseph also knew it. No one else ever knew it. Not even the Mashiach knows it. The Mashiach himself is not privy to that fact, and there are many reasons why, but he himself does not know it. Well, the Mashiach is born and lives right before the last time. He's brought up as a regular person, but with very different powers. And what those powers are, we will discuss up ahead. And we will get a very close up, you see, of what's involved in the Messianic process, what's involved in Messianic personality, and what kind of person that really is, and what the nature of his task is, in very fine detail. But because of the way he is, he does not know until right before he comes. Shortly before, he does know. Before that, he himself does not know. And you may say to me, how do I know that? Among other things, but one of the ways you know is that if the first redemption was supposed to bring in the Messianic process, who was the Mashiach at that time? If by the Exodus of Egypt, if I say that by the Exodus of Egypt, the Jews should have brought in the first opportunity of the Messianic time, correct? Yes. Then it should have been a Mashiach. Who was the Mashiach at that time? Moshe. Exactly. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach of that time. He is old. Did he know that he would be the one that was chosen to bring the Jews out of Egypt? No. He didn't know. It was as much a surprise to him as it was to everyone else. You see. Hence, Mashiach does not necessarily and does not know. I always suspected this, and I found a source written. Okay? That such is the fact, that the Mashiach does not know, and so on. But, the critical thing to realize is what that period was. Now, all this, what I'm saying, has to do with the fact of why they died. Because it had to do with the Messianic period. You see. But in essence, the point was that they all experienced the giving of Torah at Sinai themselves. That's how they knew it. Yes.
One, if you're obligated to listen to the prophet, but obviously the whole Torah, listening to the whole Torah comes under that category, right? So how do we look at that commandment that says that those who will not observe, who will not follow a prophet, will have their lives controlled, when there are many people in the world today who are not following
Torah.
Now, granted, we don't know what our national exodus is, but within this lifespan of normal, there are people who come to you and they're like, hey, my grandmother lived to me, I'm at 10, and wasn't told.
Yes, how they lived on 10,000. There are a number of answers to that question. The fundamental answer to that question is that, and I once mentioned before, is that the assumption here is that the level of free choice in every generation is equivalent. And that's not the case. In other words, if a person is born, let's say in a non-religious family, and he's never heard of the word Shabbos, can we hold him responsible for not keeping Shabbos? No. How can you? Can therefore God mete out the punishment of a person who doesn't keep Shabbos? No. You see, obviously not. Most of the Jews today are born in circumstances which is non-orthodox, where they don't know anything. Well, obviously, can you apply the same criteria to these people as you would apply to the people who witnessed the Sinaitic revelation? Of course not. Now, why that is like that has to do with a whole different thing. What you spoke about, and we go into much more. That's fundamentally the fact. But that's something else.
What about the return of the golden calf after they heard the first
It's after they heard the 10, you know.
Okay, well, they heard the first two.
Yes.
I thought they didn't.
Now, right?
Yes.
Now we're talking about the entire nation's revelation, and not everyone.
But you want to know how could they have done the golden calf?
Now, we already know that the higher you get, the higher the stronger the age, the higher the way to spread.
Okay.
But,
What are you asking? Specifically.
I'm asking.
Very popular question, but that's a long detail because you have to understand this. You think that what happened by the golden calf was a bunch of Jews got together and constructed without a calf made of gold, and they all started bowing down to it.
No, I know.
That's our conception of the golden calf. Something like what Chester B. DeMille did in the Ten Commandments. We think that that's what happened at that time. No. What I will not... Essentially, the sin of the golden calf, really, what it was in its essence, without explaining it, was the desire of the Jews at that time to build or actually create a new Mashiach. That's really what the golden calf was. Now, what am I talking about? Obviously, we have no understanding of what they really did. So the sin that they did has nothing to do with what we think. Obviously, what they did is so far removed from just what we understand. If they're speaking of constructing or creating a Mashiach, what does that mean? How do you create a Mashiach? But obviously, if they're involved in creating a Mashiach, they're involved in things which have to do with Kedusha. They're not worshiping idols. They're creating a Mashiach. Well, we don't understand what that means. How do you go create a Mashiach? But given that, without that, obviously they were involved in something with a full understanding that it was just God. But there was something wrong with it, you see. Which means that our entire understanding of what they did is inadequate. You see what I'm saying? That's the only answer I can give you at this point. You see. You don't understand what they did, what they were after, and why that was the test given to them at that time. Later on we will go that into more detail. Okay? Yes. Aaron's involvement and so on. It explains many, many things. Yes.
Why is that much?
Because in order to understand that, you have to know much more information. So let me tell you something. We've really done a lot, but there's a limit to what we can do. You see, it's something that I said before, and it's something I say again. It's important to understand what the sequence of lectures are. This is different than other lectures. How? In the sense that I will not take a topic and complete it, and allow you to think that you understand it. Nor will I take a topic which you cannot understand it, or can only understand it superficially and give it to you. I refuse to allow you to get away with superficial understanding, which I can easily give you. But if I won't do that, if I'm saying that I want you to have a profound understanding of what happened, I have to do it the right way. I've got to build you up slowly to give you the kinds of information you need to know to understand that on a profound level. You see. So I'd rather you understand it on a profound level or not talk about it. You see what I'm saying? That's the difference. That's why we have to do what we do, week after week. And there will come a time that you will understand it in a way where very few people understand it, on a very profound level. You see. But the price that we have to pay for that is time and patience. Let me go on. I don't want to do questions. I want to go on because I don't want to. Okay, you go after, okay?
Oh, fine.
Okay. What about us today? Why do we believe in what happened then? We weren't there. Why do we believe that? In order to really have a clear understanding of that, we must understand certain things. Why does God assume that we would know this or accept this thing even after we've seen the events themselves? the main way it differs is that in all other religions of the world, their origins or founders were essentially individuals, and the religion is based on the testimony of that individual. We have discussed why that's an impossibility, why that is not a valid kind of transmission. In the case of the Torah and in the case of the history that we have, God didn't reveal it to any one man. Rather, the giving of the Torah and the Exodus from Egypt were historical events, something that happened a long time ago on a national level. It's something that happened to many, many people, to millions of people. That's number one. And number two, it was written down. The exact way that it happened was written down at the time that it occurred. What happened was, the specific Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the Torah were written down in a book. In detail. It wasn't written down in general. It was written down in a detailed way. All the 10 markers, how they happened, who said who to what, who said rather what to who, you see, what followed what. Many, many minute details were written down, which recorded something which happened to millions of people. This is a very different type of transmission than any other type of transmission. And the name of this transmission is essentially called Masorah. Masorah. The word Masorah means a transmission. Our transmission, our Masorah about the Torah at Sinai and everything that happened in the Torah is very different than the Masorah of the Catholics, the Christians, or the Muslims and so on. Their Masorah is based essentially on the sayings or the testimony of one man, of what he said or what happened to him. Our Masorah has nothing to do with one man. As I said, Moses was irrelevant, really, in the giving of the law. And if you'll notice, in the whole Haggadah of Pesach, do you ever see the name of Moses? Is the name Moshe Rabbeinu at all in the whole Haggadah of Pesach? Who was the central figure in the whole Exodus from Egypt? Who? Moshe. Can you find his name in the Haggadah? No. Why not? Because Moshe was not he was a central figure, but he is not the central event. Moshe Rabbeinu did not found the Jewish religion, nor is he considered the founder or the spiritual what? Predecessor of the Jewish religion. He wasn't. Who is the founder of the Jewish religion and the predecessor really? The entire nation of Israel. You see. You see the difference? Every Jew who lived at that time was the founding father. There was not one man named Muhammad, or Jesus, or Buddha, or Confucius, or Laozi, or whatever you want. There was no such thing. There was who? There was Yankov, Reuven, Levi, Shimon, Chaim, Yisachar, Zvulun. You see what I'm saying? A nation were the founding fathers. God revealed the whole event to a nation of founding fathers, not to one individual. It was a historical event of national proportions. And it was an event which was immediately written down in detail of what happened. Okay, what does that have to do with us? That has all the difference in the world. Why? You cannot falsify a national event. That's the premise. You can falsify a personal event. You can falsify a group event. You cannot falsify a national event. Why? What am I talking about? One, two, three, four. Okay? The giving of the Torah is called Matan Torah. Okay? That's the giving of the law. Let's let's examine the Masorah in 4 generations. Okay? Matan Torah, the giving of the law and the exodus of Egypt, happened to what? Generation 1. Who was generation 1? Everybody was generation 1. Now, there were sons and children that were born after that happened. So, we are going to record a conversation that took place between 2 people, a father and a son. The father was one of the people that was part of the national experience, and the son was not. He was born later. Okay? He was born later. The son said to the father, "Hey, that's a very few book you got over here. Who wrote it?" The father says, "God wrote it, and he gave it to Moshe." The son says, "Come on. What are you talking about? I didn't witness this. Did you see it?" The father says, "I saw it. I am a direct witness to these events because this thing happened to me." The son goes over to the mother. "Ma, were you part of with Daddy when this happened?" "Of course. So was your uncle and your aunt and so on and so forth." So the son realizes, hey, the whole family knows about that. He runs outside the street, right? He sees that other people know about this. He realizes this is something that happens to everybody. Something which happens to everybody, everybody knows about. That's the rule, right? The grandchildren. The grandchildren. The 3rd son. He says his father, the 2nd son. Who wrote this book? God did. Gave it to Moshe, and they brought the Jews out of Egypt exactly like it said here. These are the words, the thoughts, the deeds, everything. The grandson says, "Hey, how do I know this?" So he said to the father, "Daddy, were you there?" He says, "No, I wasn't there." So he says, "Who was there?" "My father was there." Chances are his father was still alive. But let's say his father was not alive, the grandfather anymore. So the son says, "How do I know this?" You see, you were required to be your father, but when I talk to you, you won't see anymore. So the father says, this event not only happened to my father, it happened to every father. Every father. It happened to every grandfather who exists in Israel. So the son says, "How do I know that?" So the father says, "Go and ask. Go down the street. Talk to Chaim Yaakov and ask him if he doesn't have a tradition in his family that his Zayda happened at a thing." So he says, "I'm going to do that." He runs down the street and says, "Chaim Yaakov, wait a minute. Did you ever hear a story that the whole nation of Israel went out of Egypt and they received it?" Something happens to a nation that creates what's known as an independent tradition. For example, you have something which happens in your house. Let's say you have a tale that your mother spun about your great-grandmother, some interesting tale. You see, that's a tale or story which is told in your family line. Is it true? Well, your mother says, "Yes, I witnessed it." But it's a tale which is told in your family line because it happens to your family. Does anyone else know about it? No, because no one else is part of your family. You see. But if it's something which happens to a member of your family, which was definitely true, everyone in your family knows about it. You see. Why? Because everyone somehow was connected with this thing. What happens if every family experiences the same event? The same event. Then what happens? That every family passes down a tradition in his family of the event, independently of every other family. You see. That's the way a national tradition is created. You see. If somebody came up today, for example, somebody came up today, a historian said, "I want you to know that in 1831, the United States went to war with Outer Mongolia and lost. And that Outer Mongolia ruled the United States for a period of 5 years. And then we recaptured the United States and everything was fine." Let's say he came up with a book and wrote that today. Would we give that book any credibility? Of course not. Why? If you want to say that you went to Outer Mongolia or your Zayda went to Outer Mongolia in 1831, maybe no one's going to argue with you. But you can't tell me that In 1831, the entire United States had a war with our Mongolian lost because if such a thing would happen, everyone would have heard about it. We would have had many books on the subject. We would all have many, many family traditions on it. You see what I'm saying? You cannot make up a story. You can make up a story about yourself, about your family. You even get a bunch of people together and make up a story about themselves, a group, but you can't make up a story about an entire nation. Because if you made up such a story and then you went to the entire nation and said, this is what happened to your ancestors, they would say you're nuts. Because if this happened to our ancestors, why is it that you're the first guy that ever heard about them? Why didn't we hear the story if this is a national tradition? You see my point? You can't do that. You can't create a national tradition. You can create a family tradition. You can fool a whole bunch of people. But you cannot fool a nation. It's not possible. Alexander the Great. Did anyone ever see Alexander the Great? No. Forget about Alexander. King Richard the Lionhearted. Did any person in England ever see King Richard the Lionhearted? No. There's no living person ever. So how do we know this is King Richard? Who knows? Whoever saw him? The answer is, because obviously King Richard was a known figure to all the people at that time, to all of London and all of England. And from generation to generation, they all passed down that there was a man, King Richard. That's how no one would even think of controverting that fact. Why? Because the fact that King Richard exists is a known national tradition. His existence was witnessed probably by millions of people. You see. So I don't need historians to tell me what's true about my national tradition. You see what I'm saying? But you may say, wait a minute, that may be true. You cannot start national traditions, you see, locally or individually. But you can exaggerate them, you can distort them. You see, we all know the old telephone thing. When you tell someone by the time you get to the 80th person, it sounds like what? Like the Martians have landed. Right? So maybe that's what happened. Maybe who knows what started at that time, right? Maybe something happened, some fight between Pharaoh and Moses, I don't know, some fight, whatever the story is. Somehow all of the years, after 3,000 years, that's a long time. A lot of these people have been gagging for what? For 3,000 years. Maybe the story got out of hand. That's a good point. That's why I have to do with the second thing I said. What was passed down from generation to generation is not an oral account. It wasn't a story. It wasn't a myth or a folklore. It was a book. Because the book was the thing that was passed down from generation. And the book contained the whole story down to the facts. And what the son said to the father, he didn't say, how do I know you went out of Egypt? He said, how do I know that the accounts which exist in this book are true? You see. Which means that once the information was written out in a book, it was never changed. And the Torah that we have has never been changed. Because we all know the halacha, that a Sefer Torah has a missing letter, or one letter is changed, the whole Sefer Torah is puzzled. There are people, which is called the people who keep the Torah, where they know literally every letter in the Torah. There are Sofrim who know every letter in the Torah, how many there are. There's a count of every nun in the Torah, every samach. Everywhere where there's an ending. You ever notice something called Siv and Kri? Sometimes in the Torah it says over there, it's written in a certain letter, but you don't read it that way, you write it differently. This is all called the Masoretic text. In other words, from the beginning of time, from the time of Moshe, there are scribes and scholars who have literally kept the document itself rigidly. You think that any mistake can be crept in if they don't allow one letter to be changed? You see, this is the power of the Masorah. One, that it was written, and number two, that it was an account of a national tradition. So what happened was, that is the reason why the Masorah was so powerful that even the Christians believed it, and the Muslims. You want to start a new religion, you don't go take the old one and blow on it. You start your own. But at the time of Jesus and at the time of Muhammad, everyone knew what the Jewish tradition was. Because the temple was standing. This stuff wasn't made up. All this stuff existed. What was the Torah was clearly seen by everyone. Even the Goyim, they saw this. They didn't want to be Jewish, but they all knew about the Jewish tradition, and it was clearly known. That's why in the end, when they finally wanted to form their own religion, they had to base their religion on the Jewish religion, really. And say that we took over. And the same thing with the Muslims. Why? Because the Masorah was so powerful. The tradition of the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the Torah Sinai was so powerful and so obvious that everyone basically had to accept it. And what was happening is that at that time, in the time of Jesus actually, many Goyim were beginning to become religious or beginning to convert. You see, the Jews never went out and spread their Masorah. They never did that, because Jews don't convert. That's why the Goyim at that time at large were not aware of it, really. Because the Jews never felt themselves obligated to go out and convert. That's not a Jewish way. We don't do that. But whoever came in contact with the Jewish nation and came in contact with the Jewish tradition began to be realized that there is something here if they wanted to listen to it. You see. Essentially, this is the basic concept here. Up until maybe 150, 200 years ago, 95% of the Jews in Israel were all Orthodox. All Orthodox. It is only the beginning of the Haskalah, you see, or the Reform Judaism, maybe 150 years ago, that things began to change. But the tradition of the Jews has been kept in every household for 3,000 years. That is the fundamental testimony to the power of the Masorah. You see, even when they broke away before, when they tried to break away from the Jewish tradition at that time, nobody ever came up and said that the Torah was not true. If the person who wanted to keep the Torah, he went up to the city and became scribes. That's all. But you will never find a tradition really till 17th century, since the time of the Reform, where there was a school that said the Torah never was true. You'll never find it. What you will find was the Saddukim and the Karaite. There were certain sects of Jews that said, we don't accept the rabbinical law, but the written law, the Torah law, we all accept. Why? Why did they say we don't accept any law? Because nobody could ever contradict it. It was just too powerful. It was too obvious, really. But 200 years ago there was a break. Why? Because people at that time were so far removed, and they began to distort the events entirely and say, forget about the tradition. They began to try and do whatever they can to try and destroy it. And what happens is, they were able to succeed because Jewish education dropped. And as it dropped, there was no one anymore to keep up the Masorah really, to keep it up. So therefore, you find millions of Jews who are born today who never heard of this anymore. You see, that's why. But if a person like that comes over to you and says, how do I know the Torah is true? And you say because of this tradition, and so on, everything I said to you. And he says, well, I don't have such a tradition. So you say that's true. But you are from a family that once carried that tradition for thousands of years. You don't have it. Maybe your parents don't have it. But your Dada had it. And maybe his Dada definitely had it. There was a point in time that you go back to every family in America, every Jewish family, you see, where his grandparents or great-parents were from and did follow it and knew what the situation was. Because the validity of the divine revelation of Torah was known in every family in Israel as an obvious fact, you see. Every family accepted that, knew that, because every family had that tradition passed down from generation to generation, independently of every other family. One family didn't believe in the Torah because another family believed in it. Each family believed in the Torah because his parents believed in it, and his parents, back and back and back. And there was never one person that came in and suddenly tried to create the story of the Exodus or write the book at any point in time. Nobody could sit down and suddenly write the Torah and say, hey, this is what happened to your forefathers. You see, because if this is what happened to our forefathers, why don't we know it? How come we don't have independent traditions or independent stories in our own family tree? You see. You see what I'm saying? This is essentially the entire concept here of how it began to evolve and how it came. That the Jewish tradition or the Masorah that we have is totally different than any other Masorah which exists, because it is based on written events which were recorded and witnessed by millions of people. There is no other religion on earth which can claim that. None whatsoever. That's why God says, I depend on this. And why God says, this is sufficient. I don't have to reveal myself to every generation. It's sufficient that I've revealed myself to one entire generation. If God had revealed himself to one man or a group of people, we could say, well, that's not enough for us. But God said, I didn't do that. I revealed myself to every person who existed in the land of Israel, in one time, to the entire nation. And that was sufficient. Because that entire nation now has in their national consciousness the events of the Torah itself. You see. Are there any questions? What? No. Not, we have, but there are many people. No, they're right. No, we have the experience, but what happened is it's been broken. It's been broken, you see, and many people are very distant from it. True. When you say what's going on today, what do you mean what's going on? That's what's going on. Why is it going on today? Why is this allowed to happen? There are reasons for that in terms of the providence itself. But fundamentally, you have to know yourself. If somebody comes over to you and wants to understand it, you have to explain it just like I've explained it, with the same clarity. And I don't say this to jest. You must review your notes, and you must understand what I've said exactly. Because this is the essence, in many ways, of the whole itself, of its validity. There are many other aspects of its validity. There are. But fundamentally, this is the main point in which it all stands. The fact that it was given to all Jews, that the founding fathers were a nation, not a group of individuals who wrote it, but everyone, you see. And this is fundamental to the concept.
Isn't there the Torah in every Jew that's born?
But when I talk about what's in terms of his neshama,
yeah,
that's something else. But you cannot read your neshama. If you could, everybody would keep the Torah. Therefore, we have to rely on our intellect and what we understand.
But as you're talking and we believe what you're saying, doesn't that reinforce our neshama as you're...
Yes. Hopefully it does. Yeah.
I mean,
we
can
but
feel
you
it.
You cannot read this from your neshama. You cannot know this.
Can't we? If we're sitting here tonight, this reinforcement, if you're responding, doesn't that...
Well, it's very important for people to have an exact or precise understanding of what the thing is.
Yeah, but...
In regard to what you said before about mass hysteria, you see, and so on. The whole proposition is a ludicrous one. Mass hysteria is what? In mass hysteria, you can get a bunch of people to believe in a certain thing. You cannot get a bunch of people to witness a series of many, many miraculous events. You cannot do that in mass hysteria. You can get people to believe that a certain person said something about himself, or you can get mass hysteria to people to believe in what somebody else said. You cannot get 300 people to suddenly say that the following 36 miracles have happened to us, ourselves, not sane people, psychotic people. Sane people, how can you get sane people to acknowledge? How can you get 1 million sane people? How can you get 100 sane people to all say, yes, mass hysteria, we all walked through the Red Sea, you see? There was an ocean that suddenly split, and we all walked through it, that suddenly in the middle of the day it became dark for 3 days, and that if you pick up some water from the Nile it would be blood. How can you get people to acknowledge that kind of thing? Hysteria? What kind of hysteria? That's far beyond the concept of normalcy. Only deranged people would create that. And you can't get a group of deranged people together. You all know that. On anything.
Or maybe
I've never heard of a consensus of psychotic people, have you? Psychosis is an idiosyncratic affair. It's a very individual experience. Very private, not shared by anyone else.
What about Hitler and what he did to...
So what did he say, Hitler? What did he say? That he was a god? No. That what? He started a new religion? No. He simply laid down the theory that the Jews were of inferior status and therefore have to be destroyed. That's not mass hysteria. That's hysteria. But Hitler wasn't saying anything about miracles or about things which are beyond natural law or about receiving supernatural events. Hitler wasn't talking about that. You can create mass hysteria. Yeah, you can get a group worked up. You can. But you have to relate events which are within the reason of a person. You see, within the domain of rationality. You can create mass hysteria. You can create emotional fervor. That's true. But you can't subvert to a bunch of normal people reality and expect them to believe it. You can't do that to 30 people. How are you going to do that to 3 million? And anyone who says that is an absolute fool. He's saying that because he doesn't want to believe in the Torah. He wants to grab anything he can, any cute little thing that he can to say, I don't want to accept the Torah because I don't want to do it. I don't want the restrictions. I want to live the way I want to live. I want to have a good time. You see. Any other questions? Yeah.
It seemed like I haven't taken in anything you said.
That's all right.
But I have to go all the way through.
Okay.
There are other traditions that have become very compelling for large multitudes of people.
Yes.
And those traditions make truth claims.
Yes.
And those traditions are grounded in text. And how are we to understand the possibility of those traditions taking hold and being found credible by such vast numbers of people? And how does that question not...
Because you have to examine the nature of those traditions. If you examine it, you will see some interesting things. There has never been a tradition that supernatural events occurred to an entire nation. There is no such tradition. There are traditions, you see, that something happened to one person. But the nature of that tradition is not that it's true. The nature of that tradition, even for example, let's say for example in Islam, in the Muslim tradition, what is their tradition? If you go to a Muslim person and you say, do you believe in the Quran? Without a doubt. Do you believe it was given by God? Without a doubt. And they all accept it. How was it given by God? So they'll say, Allah spoke to Muhammad, and Muhammad wrote it down. And he said, this is what God said. And I believe that God said this. Now, then you say, how do you know that Muhammad spoke to God? I believe. He can't go beyond that. Examine anyone's tradition. Everyone has traditions. And they believe in certain things. But the Jewish tradition is not a belief. The Jewish tradition is a fact. It's a knowledge. That's why the Torah says, when the Torah says, Ata Horei Seladas, Ki Hashem Elokim Eino B'Vadoi. Ata Horei Seladas, you know what Moshe says to? Moshe says to all of the Jews, in the Torah itself, it says, you have all been shown to know that there is only one God. Because you and I have all witnessed what has happened. Moses is talking to the entire nation of Israel. He's not saying that this is what happened to me. Moses didn't say God spoke to me and no one else. Moses said in the Torah that not only I have experienced it, you will experience it. Moses is talking to the entire nation. How can such a story get started? You're confusing the concept of what's called a belief tradition from what's called a knowledge tradition. You see, most traditions that you see today are belief traditions. If you examine them, the person says, yes, there are thousands of people that believe something, but they believe something in terms of only belief. If you examine what do you believe in, ultimately what it comes down to is a testimony of one or more individuals that such a thing happens. So many people want to believe that. Okay, they want to believe that, but they can't give you a credible reasoning process to verify what they believe as definite truth. They can't. When you get down to it, they cannot do it. So you wonder, why do they believe in it? You're right, people are emotional people. They want to believe in something. That's number one. But when you ask them, what do you believe in them, they believe that certain things happen. But you can't create an emotional belief on supernatural events that happen to a nation. Nobody's going to want to believe that if it didn't happen. That's absurd, really. You see? Because that goes beyond normal human reason already. Even in the New Testament, with Jesus, all the accounts that happened to Jesus are specific miracles that he specifically did, or whatever happened to you, and so on. And the truth of the matter is, Jesus was able to do certain miracles also, because at that time they knew how to do certain things. They could do certain things to change the seva, the natural law. You see, but you'll never find in the New Testament statements, you see, that things happen to an entire nation, and God spoke to a whole nation. You'll never see such things.
So it really, I mean, when you try to get down to what the strongest thing is that you have to stand on, it's the fact, it's the fact that what's being claimed is being claimed about a vast multitude of people.
What's being claimed is being claimed about a vast multitude of people, in a written account itself, because that itself was what was passed down, you see. And that such a thing could never start or never be accepted by that multitude if it were not true of the multitude.
And how do we know that the initial multitude that accepted the account is the multitude that experienced Sinai? How do we know that?
How do we know that? That's the multitude that started the tradition.
Like how do we validate to ourselves that this account came in time and was initially tested?
You validate it in the following way, that every house in the nation of Israel has a tradition, except for the last 100 years, because we know it's been broken, you see. But basically we know for 3,000 years, every Jew had a tradition. From where? Not from his Rebbe, or from another Jew, from his own parents, and they from their parents, and they from their parents, each family on an individual basis, that the Torah itself, the account that was given in the Torah, is what actually happened. And the account in the Torah was witnessed, not only by his parents, but it's a national event. That's what explains why every different family has the same tradition, independent of each other. You see. It's different than any other Masorah or any other tradition. Totally different in that way. Because there is no Masorah that has for it the basis of an entire nation, and that has independent traditions in every family in that nation. There is none, you see. When I mean independent traditions, independent, number one, each tradition being its own, you see. The tradition in Israel is not the same as the tradition in the Catholic home. In the Catholic home, the tradition is, the New Testament is true because my priest says it's true. That's why it's true. Or because the Pope said it's true. But in the Jewish home, the Torah is true because my parents told me from his parents that our family personally experienced what happened over here. You see the difference in tradition? It's a whole different type of concept. It's a whole different type of tradition. And you can examine all other types of traditions, and you will see that all types of traditions are not based on that, but are based on something of a specific individual, you see, and that the thing is true because it was taught by other people, but not that it happened to everybody, you see. It's a whole different thing. The tradition is that there are certain people who say this is true, and we all believe it. But in the Torah, in the Jewish home, it's not that there are certain people who say this is true, but in the Torah, it's a tradition that every family says it's true because it happened to every family, from generation to generation, you see. And every family has its own separate tradition, you see. This is passed down from grandfather to son to grandchild. It has nothing to do with a Rebbe or not a Rebbe. It has nothing to do with being to yeshiva or not going to yeshiva. These are all irrelevant, you see. You kind of understand what I'm saying? Yes.
We can get this, but for us to really get this as a valid fact requires us being able to go down, literally, I mean, if somebody wants to really understand it experientially from our end,
yes,
it means that we have to be able to go to families where their blind is not broken, or we have the fortune of going to a great-grandparents or grandparents where we could question, we would say, well, what about your parents and what about their parents? You know what I'm saying?
yes.
Because for Ba'al Tshuva,
Yes, that's a valid point.
still, we're talking about learning it here, we're talking about still a level of
Yes,
belief.
yes.
Until we go into homes where the traditional line has not been broken. Until you go to Meir Sharim, and sound people, and families, which we can do, fortunately.
That's a very valid point. That's a very valid point. Right. I would imagine that for a person who had not had that tradition in the home, and essentially, or who's a Baal Tshuva, his experience essentially is totally from the outside, really. So he doesn't, that feeling or that weight of a family tradition in that way coming from is somewhat like, I see it's a valid point. In any case, at least know these critical concepts. The notion that it is a national tradition and a written account of that national tradition, that had come down from every Jewish household for 3,000 years without any contradiction. That was the facts of the reality. That was the facts, and so on. And that these events were accepted because of the fact that they were so clearly understood and known in all the families, you see, throughout the time. Yes.
After the hurt, also made the confirmation that your family and your grandparents or great-grandparents wouldn't come under the system of Judaism. They wouldn't call themselves Jews. You can't find it in the family unless that was passed down to them as a Jew. Somewhere along the line. You have to be Jew, you have to prove you're Jews.
But I mean, the definition for a family of the Jewish, varies once that line is broken.
Yes. Yes. What it means to be a Jew, but she's saying just the very fact that you know there's still something passed down from generation to generation. Well, that's a good point. Even if you haven't come from a religious background, there's something that your parents say, I'm Jewish, and that there's something about being Jewish which goes back and back and back. There is something like that. That's a remnant of that kind of tradition. Okay, I think we're going to have to stop here. Yes, because it's really tense. Well, the last one, yeah.
Well, I don't know if you would like to wait.
Oh, perhaps then we'll do that. Let me just do that. Once, hold up. Yeah, we've changed the, well, let me just announce it. Excuse me. You want to come back here for a second? 1 minute. Just want to make a short announcement. We at the end of the session, a little bit, and I just want you to explain what the structure is, which will be from henceforth, with the feelings of the group. As I've mentioned before, there's a fee attached to the sessions itself, and what basically we would like to do is to run the fee to some degree like a course. And what I've kind of decided, I've spoken to Charlotte, and I'd like to find out what the consensus of the group is on that. Instead of collecting the fee every week, in that sense, is to assess a specific fee each particular week, assuming that the person can handle that particular charge, and to pay once a month, either by check or by cash, for that entire month, and that would be it. And each person, essentially, what it does is that each person commits himself for 1 month to those who want to commit themselves. And as you pay, what you do is you pay in advance or during that month for that month, and that's it. You see, that commits you for that month, whether you come or not. So what that does is gives it the regularity and the stability of a course, which is exactly really what I want to do. The check is tax deductible. You can either pay in cash or tax deductible, and the check is made out to. Let me just clear this. This loan, Yosef, okay, and the amount that we assess basically, which we think is fair, and if for people who could, if a person cannot afford it because they just unemployed or whatever have you, then it's free. If, however, you're in some kind of financial capacity, the amount that we've said, I feel is fair, is, let's say, $6 a week. I don't know how the group will take that. I thought that would be fair. The men pay more. They do. So, as far as I know, unless someone has a very serious objection to that particular fee and feels that it's difficult, it was $6. Now, what we're doing is to accept a month, so we would accept, let's say, payment for the 4 weeks in advance.
So
that would be checks made out for $24, or that's basically how would like to run it. That would be the most organized and simplest way to do that.
So tonight we'd make one out.
So for those of you who have checks, to make it out, if not, the next week is alright. We will start from this week. For those people who are committed, for the people who are new and want to think about joining the group, you can think about it. That's alright. You can come for several times and decide whether or not you're interested in this kind of thing and you want to continue. For those people who are committed and so on, that basically, I think, is the easiest and probably the best type of arrangement. Because I want to establish this with some kind of stability similar to a course with both the people who feel